Dear respected panelists, dear valued audience and followers and viewers, good evening. On behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, Director General of Trans Research and Advisory, and the Trans family, it's my pleasure to welcome you all at this virtual E-Symposium, Economic Stimulus Programs, Requirements and Challenges. This symposium is part of a series of specialized debate under the theme Trans Global Economic Forum. Trans is organizing this symposium based on its objective to discuss and analyze vital international strategic and economic issues for creating an environment for dialogue and scientific discussion. We are honored to host in this symposium an elite group of economic researchers working at major international organizations and think tanks. They will highlight this vital policy issue, which is devised to support economics in confronting the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. Now I will give the podium for moderating this symposium to my colleague, Mr. Mahmoud Sharif, Director of Economic Studies Department at Trans Research and Advisory. Please, Mr. Mahmoud Sharif, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Excellency Mr. Ahmed Ustad. Earlier this year, when the pandemic started, economic policy maker pumped cash into the economy almost indiscriminately while battling the pandemic with lockdown. Output was collapsing, and the need and the scale of support rightly eclipsed any worries about its cost, accuracy, or side effect. Given that there is a tentative sign of economic recovery, the policy debate has shifted to whether, when, and how far to trim stimulus package. We have to admit that the economic assistance and stimulus work. That being said, there's a cost to continuing the stimulus, i.e. double-digit budget deficit, and at the same time, lockdown and measures to halt the economy come at a cost as COVID is changing our life. A stimulus policy must recognize the relationship between the extent of a stimulus and the improvement in output and employment. Also, outbreak and doldrums and infection could become the new norm, and economic policy must be ready for activating and listening of stimulus policy measures and packages. Welcome our distinguished leading economists to this important platform to discuss economic stimulus program requirement and challenges. This symposium will address the need for economic stimulus program to minimize the effect of COVID-19. It will discuss challenges facing such programs and focus on the following 5 topics: unconventional monetary policy to minimize the consequences of COVID-19, lesson from developed economy and the 2008 financial crisis, the trade-off between conventional monetary policy and unconventional monetary policy, also the need to understand the cost and benefit of stimulus fiscal policies, and what is required in terms of structural policy and development of infrastructure in preparation for post-COVID economies. The role of government spending, technology, and medical R&D under COVID-19. And finally, comparison and application of stimulus packages between highly industrialized and periphery countries. Allow me to give the floor to our first speaker, His Excellency Dr. Patrick Lenné, Assistant Director at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and adjunct professor of University de Paris, who will shed light on unconventional monetary policy to minimize the consequences of COVID-19, lessons from developed economies, and the 2008 financial crisis. Yeah.
Now that I've unmuted, thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Mohammed Sharif. It's a Great
Thank
pleasure
you.
to be here tonight and discuss this important issue of the economic stimulus program in our countries. So let me share my screen. I would like to take you through a presentation that I've prepared. So my presentation is going to be based on a review of the United States economy that we published just last week. So it's really new, and it's part of a regular periodic review undertaken by the OECD every 2 years for every of the 37 members of the OECD. So we just completed the review of the yesterday, and I'm going to not to go through the whole publication, which you can find online. It's free to read, and you can download the main aspect of it, but I'm going to go through some of the most important aspects in terms of the topic today, economic, and mostly on the monetary policy side. Whole situation started with the coronavirus arriving in our countries. The first cases really were detected in March, and action was taken rapidly to monitor the situation. So in the United States, the number of new cases that you see on this slide has been increasing fast. So from late March, the US authorities decided to take measures to confine and to contain. So they asked non-essential businesses to shut down. But it was many services that involve person-to-person contact. And many states also asked households to stay at home to stop the infection. So that worked, and as you see in April, the number of new cases stabilized. So by late April, many states have decided to relax the confinement measures, so to let businesses reopen gradually, and to let people go out of their home. And that seemed to have worked for a while. Through May, you see the number of new cases coming down. But it looks like the US has been deconfining too soon before the circulation of the virus was really stopped. And as you can see, starting in the middle of June, the number of new cases has increased again, and it keeps on increasing. So as of now, there have been 3.4 million Americans who have been tested positively. There are confirmed cases. And sadly, there's been many deaths as well. So as of today, there have been 137,000 Americans dying from the COVID-19. So on this chart, you see as well the number of people dying every day. It's a moving average over 7 days because the time series is very volatile. So dramatically, the number of deaths has peaked at almost 4,000 a day. And then the confinement measures have worked. So, business shutting down, people staying home, testing, isolating people, washing their hands, wearing a mask, all that worked. So the number of deaths has really come down. But as you see at the end of the series, starting in June, it looks like the number of deaths no longer declines, it stagnates. And looking at the very latest number, it looks like the number of deaths is increasing again. So we are not far from 1,000 people dying every day from the virus. So I think, as you said, Dr. Mohammed Sharif, the situation, the epidemic is not finished. Unfortunately, we still have to live with the virus in many of our countries. and it's very unclear when this will go behind us. Until we find a vaccine, and the timing there is very unclear, or until we find a treatment that works, we will have to live this virus and be very careful. And from time to time, we may have to reconfine, and that's going to hurt economic life. So moving from the sanitary situation to the economic situation, what you see here on this slide is US real GDP growth. So it's a year-on-year growth of GDP in real terms. And what I've shown there is the whole period from the last crisis, from the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, and then the current crisis, so that on this slide you can compare the severity of the two crises. And clearly what you see immediately is that the current recession of activity, the current contraction of activity is much more severe than the contraction of activity in the global financial crisis. So what I've shown here is the OECD projections for GDP until the end of 2021. So these projections were published in June. Obviously, it's very hard to do economic forecasts right now because of the huge uncertainty about the sanitary situation. So I will not call them forecasts. I've used the word projection. I think an even better word would be scenarios. We've done scenario, making assumptions about the spread of the virus and the confinement measures and lockdown, etc. And because there's so much uncertainty, we've done actually two scenarios. The first scenario, what we call the single hit, is that the virus will be contained and we don't have to lock down once again. The second scenario is what we call a double hit, is where the virus comes back, maybe because it's a seasonal virus. And in the third quarter, we would have a comeback of the virus and again, confinement measures. So what you see on this chart, I've only shown one of the two scenarios, but in the next slide, I will show both of them, is that the peak to trough decline in GDP. So that's what people do in the, when they look at business cycles, they compare the peak of GDP before the crisis to the trough of GDP at the depth of the recession. So in our scenario, the decline of GDP peak to trough would be somewhere between -10, -12, depending on whether we look at the single hit or double hit scenario. And that's about 3 times deeper than the global financial crisis, where GDP declined by 4%. So at the time, we thought that a decline of GDP by 4% during the financial crisis was extremely severe. But the current decline we're looking at now, is 3 times as much. So we're looking at an extremely severe, deep recession, contraction of activity, with the risk of long-lasting effect. So my previous slide was the rate of change of GDP, and now this slide is on the level of GDP. So what you're seeing here is 3 scenarios. The first scenario, and that's the dashed red line, is our economic outlook or forecast before the crisis, so published in December last year, before the virus came there. And you see, we were fairly optimistic about the US economic prospect. The US economy has done very well, has recovered from the global financial crisis, kept on expanding, very low unemployment rate. We expected the GDP growth to be around 2% this year. So that was our forecast before the crisis. The blue line is our new scenario of a double hit. So as you see, we have a little recovery in the third quarter, and then another contraction in the fourth quarter when we expect when we assume the virus to come back. And the yellow line is the single hit, so the virus doesn't come back. So what's important on this slide is to compare these two scenarios with our previous forecasts. And I've written on this slide the loss of output caused by the recession. So in the single hit, and that's at the end of 2021, right? So that's after already some process of recovery. So at the end of 2021, the loss of output would be $1.4 trillion. So these numbers are so big that they're hard to understand. So $1.4 trillion is about the size of Australian GDP for 1 year. So it would be like, we lose the whole of GDP of Australia, in US GDP for 1 year. So that's quite enormous. And in the double hit scenario, we lose 1.8 trillion. So that's about the GDP of Canada that will be lost. So in other words, there is a recession followed by the recovery. We expect the recovery to be gradual. And by the end of next year, we expect some long-lasting damage, some scarring effect. We don't go back to normal. It will take much longer than that to go back to normal. So that's a challenge for policymakers, both in terms of fiscal policy and monetary policy. So the US has done a lot in response to the crisis. This big fiscal stimulus, a lot of monetary support. Importantly, there is the Paycheck Protection Program. So this is financial support to businesses, mostly SMEs, so that they can keep on paying workers, so that they don't have to dismiss workers, so that they keep workers on the payroll and can bring them back to work as soon as the crisis is over. Another important package is the CARES Act, $300 billion of income support. So it's the famous $1,200 check sent to every American taxpayer. There's a $250 billion support to unemployment benefits. So the unemployment benefit have been increased. Every job seeker receive at least $600 per month. So a lot has been done, to help workers and to help businesses during this difficult period. Let me. I could talk a lot about fiscal policy, but my topic here is to discuss monetary policy, especially the unconventional measures. So, as you know, the Federal Reserve, the central bank in the United States, has a dual mandate. So the first part of the mandate is they have to achieve what the mandate calls price stability. And the Federal Reserve interprets that as being to keep inflation close to 2%. They have made it clear that this is a symmetric target. So it's not below 2%, it's around 2%, as opposed to the European Central Bank, which has a target of keeping inflation close but below 2%. Here it's a symmetric target. So as you see on this slide, the slide shows inflation rates and the latest measures, different measures of inflation, the consumer price index in blue, personal consumption expenditure deflator in red, and then the personal consumption expenditure excluding energy and food, so it's the core inflation rate. So those three inflation measures are running very low. They're somewhere between 0.5 and 1%. So they are well below the target. We also keep track of inflationary expectation, which is important because inflation expectations are a good predictor of future inflation. and inflation expectations have declined as well. So one impact of this crisis is that the Federal Reserve is having difficulties meeting its mandate to keep inflation close to 2%. Now, the second part of the mandate is that what is called maximum sustainable employment. And the Federal Reserve has interpreted that as meaning that they have to keep the unemployment rate close to 4.1%. So that's how the members of the Federal Open Market Committee interpret their mandate. They need to keep unemployment close to 4%. So on this slide, I've shown the unemployment rate after the last crisis, the financial crisis, in blue, and the current unemployment rate. So what's important to see on this slide is that unemployment rises very fast. So it went from 4 to 10% during the financial crisis in just a year and a half. So it rises very fast, but it's very slow to come down. So in other words, businesses are quick to dismiss workers, but they're very slow to rehire workers. So it took 10 years for the unemployment rate to go back to 4%, which is the objective of the Federal Reserve. So during these 10 years, the Federal Reserve had to keep a very supportive monetary policy because they were not achieving their mandate of achieving low inflation. So it's important to keep in mind that things don't turn around quickly, especially on the labor market. It takes a long time, and during this long period, monetary policy has to be supportive. So now the red line is the current unemployment rate. So before the crisis, the US unemployment rate was 3.5%. It went all the way to 14.7%. So, the unemployment rate has never increased so fast in US history. It's a huge, very rapid increase in unemployment rate. As businesses were shut down, they had to dismiss workers. Now, as you see, the unemployment rate has come down in June to 11%. So it's been, some improvement, as businesses were allowed to reopen. For instance, retail trade is operating once again. So workers in the retail trade industry were called back. But we're still very high. We're still at 11%. So big question is, how fast do we go back to 4%, which is the objective? And if history served as a lesson, it might take a very long time to go back to 4%. There's a process of reallocation of workers. Firms go bankrupt, so workers cannot go back to their former employer. They have to change industry. They have to change state. They have to reskill themselves. So all of that takes time. And during this period of reallocation of workers, of rematching between workers and businesses, monetary policy has to be supportive. So what should be the right monetary policy? In our textbook, we've been teaching the Taylor rule. So the Taylor rule is from John Taylor, who invented the Taylor rule. And the Taylor rule is a calculation of what should be the interest rate, based on a dual mandate. So is the interest rate, based on the inflation and how far it is from the 2% target. And based on the unemployment rate, how far it is from the 4% target. So what you see there is that the Taylor rule has been pretty good at, predicting. So the Taylor rule is the blue line there. So there are different ways to calculate the Taylor rule, but I picked one. It's explained at the bottom of the slide. And the red line is the actual interest rate set by the Federal Reserve. So you see the Taylor rule has been pretty good, but already in 2009, you see that the blue line, the Taylor rule, goes in negative territory. So it says the Federal Reserve should have set interest rate at almost -2%. And now, at the very end of this year, time series, you see that the Taylor rules say that the interest rate should be set at almost -6%, extremely negative. Now, the Federal Reserve has made it very clear they don't want to push interest rate in negative territory. They don't want to go below 0%. So they are stuck at what is called the zero bound, the zero lower bound. So currently the Federal Reserve target is to keep the rate between 0 and 0.25%. They cannot go below that. So they have to do something else. So what they do is they go to unconventional measures. They go into new territory for monetary policy. Things you don't find in the traditional textbook of economics. So the first part of this unconventional monetary policy is called quantitativism. It's the central bank purchasing assets in the financial market. And when the central bank purchases assets, they inject liquidity in the system. Right? So they create money to purchase this asset. So what you see on the slide there is the size of the Federal Reserve balance sheet. Is the size of the asset side of the balance sheet. And you see already during the last financial crisis, the Federal Reserve did several expansion of its balance sheet. QE1 at the end of 2008. So the balance sheet went from 1 trillion to 2 trillion as the Federal Reserve was buying assets like mortgage-based securities, treasury securities. It was not enough, so they went into QE2 in 2010. Remember, the unemployment rate was still well above 4%, right? So they were not at full employment according to their definition. They had to do more. And again, in 2014, they do QE3, so they do another round of asset purchase, bringing the total balance sheet to 4.5 trillion. After that, there's a bit of a decline, things normalize. So the unemployment rate goes back to 4%, inflation comes close to 2%. They achieve their mandate, so they can exit this unconventional policy gradually. But with the COVID crisis, they immediately started again quantitative easing, and they brought the balance sheet close to 7 trillion. So this is part of the new toolkits of monetary policy. Something we didn't find in the economic textbook when I was a student, and when I started to teach as well economics. Interest rate was the only tool available to central bankers. Now the toolkit is actually very vast. They can purchase assets, so they become a sort of dealer or buyer of last resort, right? So when nobody wants to buy on the financial market, the central bank will be there to buy. And by doing so, they reduce yield, they reduce interest rates. So they encourage investment. So in the last financial crisis, they were buying mostly in the housing-related markets. So they were buying MBS, mortgage-based securities. They were buying GSEs, so the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the US agency that guarantee mortgage debt. So the 2008 crisis was aimed at the mortgage-related market and the housing-related market. The current crisis has nothing to do with the housing market, obviously. The goal is really to inject liquidity and facilitate credit to the corporate sector, and also to support the federal government in its fiscal measures to help the economy. Second type of intervention measure is lending support measures. So the central bank act as a lender of last resort. So in financial crisis, they did a lot of lending to the banking system, also to money market funds, which risked, like they say, breaking the buck, meaning going below their value. They were supporting the commercial paper market. Currently, the lending measures are to corporation, SMEs, municipalities. Third type of measure is extending liquidity operation. So they inject a lot of liquidity to make sure that there's no dysfunctioning in the market and that the banks can keep finding the liquidity that they need. Since the last financial crisis, a new tool has been also macroprudential tool. So these are measures that concern the banks, their capital adequacy, their liquidity, concerning the conditions for borrowers to obtain loans from the banks. So you can tighten when you are worried about financial stability, but you can ease as well. And that's what has been done. We've been easing these capital buffers, liquidity buffers, so that the banks have more space to operate. Negative interest rate, I already said that. It's down a lot now around the world. The European Central Bank has pushed its policy rate in negative territory. Scandinavian banks as well, Denmark as well. Japan is a little bit in negative territory. The Federal Reserve has made it clear they don't want to go in negative territory. There are a number of institutional reasons that make it difficult in the US financial market to do that. And the new instrument that is not yet in place, but that may happen, that sometimes being debated now, is called yield curve control. So it's setting a target for long-term interest rates. So there are a lot of positive impact of the measure, restore credit flows, facilitate the recovery, reduce the risk of non-performing loans, reduce the risk of sovereign default, encourage investors to go into the stock market, create room for fiscal policy because it makes it cheaper for the fiscal authorities to borrow, enables as well investment in public goods because the cost of debt is very low. So this is a good time, for instance, to invest in measures to mitigate climate change. So these are the positive impact. There are a number of risks with unconventional policy that shouldn't be underestimated. That has to be watched. So a lot of injection of liquidity is going to boost asset prices. It keeps stock prices high, it keeps bond prices high. And you've noticed that stock markets are doing well in some countries. The Nasdaq, is at its historical record. So that raises concern about overvaluation of asset prices. So what this policy is doing is encouraging borrowing. So there is a risk of encouraging over-indebtedness. Now, macroprudential measures can be used to prevent that, but there's a risk there. There is a risk also of harming bank profitability because interest rates are negative. So basically, when the banks bring money to the central bank to be kept in reserves, they receive a negative interest rate, meaning they have to the commercial banks have to pay the central bank. Now, we've done some research on that. We don't find empirical evidence that unconventional monetary policies hurting bank profitability, but that's a question. There's also an impact on income inequality because, like I said, we boost asset prices and assets, are mostly held by wealthy households. So it boosts the wealth. We risk also to keep zombie firms alive, and we risk to create more. So let me finish by talking about whether this unconventional monetary policy makes sense for emerging markets. Like I say, it's been used a lot in OECD countries, advanced economies, but does it make sense for emerging markets to do the same? And many central banks in the emerging market, they do not want to go there. Or traditionally, they have been very reluctant to go there. Many of them are not yet constrained by the zero low bound, so they have room to cut interest rate, although I'm going to show you the next slide that some central banks in emerging markets are getting close to zero. And in order to do this very large monetary injection, it's important to have credibility and independence. And that's not the case in all emerging markets. You need to have inflation expectations that are well anchored. That's not the case. And a big concern is that all this injection of liquidity would lead to a depreciation of the currency with higher inflation, risk of financial instability if there are foreign exchange mismatches. They are concerned about sudden stop capital outflow if the central bank does that. And often the central bank in emerging market, they do not have the legal framework to do that. So they've been reluctant. That's not happened much. And indeed, there are reasons to be worried about currency depreciation. So this chart is showing the depreciation of the currency in a selection of emerging markets. And as you see in Brazil, South Africa, Argentina, Turkey. So the red triangle is the maximum depreciation during this crisis. The blue was the depreciation during the global financial crisis. So, Brazil, the currency has depreciated in terms of US dollar up to 30%. So it's a very large depreciation. Same in South Africa, in Argentina. But then if you look at the right-hand side, the currency of some emerging markets have been pretty stable, especially in Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, China, Romania. So in this country, it looks like things have changed. They're much better than 10 years ago during the global financial crisis. You see Poland, for instance, in the global financial crisis, the Polish zloty depreciated almost by 45%. This time around, the currency of Poland, the zloty, has not moved much. So that's my final slide, just to show you that some central banks in emerging markets are getting very close to the zero. So I've done a list here of central banks that have reduced interest rate. This is the latest numbers, almost to zero. Chile, 0.5, Czech Republic, 0.25, Hong Kong, 0.5, Hungary, 0.25, Israel, 0.10, Korea, 0.5, Peru, 0.25, Poland, 0.10, Thailand, 0.50. So they are almost constrained by the zero bound. And this central bank have started to do very small, purchase of assets. So, for instance, Thailand has bought some corporate debt. Chile has bought some bank debt. Poland as well has injected money by purchasing. So there's a very interesting study published just a few weeks ago by the BIS, the Bank of International Settlement. They look at asset purchases in emerging markets, and they find positive effect in terms of reducing yield, and they don't find a negative impact in terms of currency depreciation. So I'm going to finish that on the, making the conjecture that, maybe the time has come for emerging market to also consider doing very cautiously, one step at a time, try some unconventional monetary policy measure in order to support the economy during this, very serious situation where we are. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Patrick, for your highly informative lecture and presentation. It was really informative, and it shed light on the unconventional policy tools and what are the limitations, what are the risks, and what are the benefit to it. Now I would like to turn the floor to Dr. Stephen Hertog, Associate Professor in Comparative Politics, Department of Government at the London School of Economics and Political Science, to shed light on stimulus fiscal policies, cost-benefit calculation, with focus on gains from stimulus and stability.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud, and thanks to Trends for involving me in this very useful event. I have to immediately issue a health warning, which is that my presentation is going to be a lot less rich and less data heavy than that of Dr. Lenain. It'll also be a lot shorter. So the one thing I perhaps can do is to get us back into the time schedule. And what I want to focus on quickly on a more kind of preliminary basis is how the fiscal policy dimensions of the COVID crisis are really different in the GCC and more generally in oil-dependent economies from the way they are in most of the advanced economies on which we've seen all that great data. And there are a couple of warnings, I think, to be made that some of the insights from more advanced or tax-based production economies don't always travel that well to economies like the GCC, including on fiscal adjustment. And after making that kind of case, more generally, I want to say some specific things about what I think is emerging gradually as the most important fiscal challenge in the Gulf economies, which is the cost of public sector employment, and how that is becoming a more relevant and more burning issue going forward after COVID. And then I want to propose some ideas on how that could be dealt with reforms. But first, some general remarks on the fiscal context of the COVID crisis in the GCC. First, quite obviously, the immediate fiscal gap created by the COVID crisis is significantly larger in GCC than in most other economies in the world because of the impact on oil prices. That's a mechanism that we don't have in other resource-poor countries or in very diversified economies that are less oil-dependent. And that means that the immediate fiscal damage is significantly large, and as a result, the fiscal stimulus packages that have been put together in the Gulf are actually proportionally a lot smaller than what you've seen in OECD countries. So even without any additional fiscal stimulus, the deficits in the GCC would be much larger than they would be in OECD countries. And in pretty much all GCC countries, we're going to have double-digit deficits despite very modest stimulus. So most of the stimulus has actually been monetary through central banks. There hasn't been that much fiscal stimulus. The bit of fiscal stimulus that's been there has been for direct spending on the health sector and for mostly preserving the employment of nationals in the private sector through temporary wage subsidies, which is a very good thing, but is fiscally a relatively small item. But there's also a kind of less obvious way in which the fiscal system is different, and the macro fiscal context in the GCC is very different. And that is that growth and economic activity in the GCC in general is more dependent on state spending than in advanced economies. And that means that in a way there is no kind of natural growth rate the way you would have it in a non-oil economy. Instead, growth is really still to a very important extent determined by the level of state spending. And that means that to get back to a previous growth rate, state spending will have to be stepped up again after the crisis, and it will arguably have to reach a higher level than it had before the crisis, because historically most growth was just the result of a direct correlation between how much money the government spends, which then determines how much money is injected into the private economy. So it's a very different kind of macroeconomic cycle. It's more of a one-way relationship than the macroeconomic cycle in advanced economies, where you have private economic growth that then generates tax revenue, and the tax revenue in turn can be spent to potentially stimulate more growth. This feedback loop through a tax mechanism is really lacking in the GCC. The taxes, there's VAT in a couple of countries, a couple of other fees, but there's still a very small share of overall state income. So whereas in OECD countries, if you have a smartly designed fiscal policy at a time when there's an output gap, the economy produces below capacity, you can use stimulus to get the economy back to its natural growth rate. You can fill that kind of output gap. And as a result, further down the line, you'll actually recoup some of your spending through larger tax revenue. And depending on sort of how Keynesian are in your beliefs, you could even recoup all of your stimulus spending. You could even have a positive revenue effect from the stimulus spending. So what's called a Keynesian multiplier, the idea that you stimulate the economy, but then the economy gets back to its natural higher growth path, and you recoup that money that you've spent originally through tax revenue. You don't have that mechanism in the GCC. So that means that the money that is spent for stimulus is really then, it's lost. It generates growth, but that growth generates very little state revenue in return, just a little bit of money, perhaps through larger VAT receipts. So in that sense, the dependence of the economy on state spending is much larger, and the financing of state spending is less sustainable because you don't recoup the spending through taxes that you levy on a growing economy. And that, I think, means in the current context of COVID that sort of the fiscal scarring, the damage to deficits and to reserves that the crisis is creating is probably more permanent. There'll be a longer term effect fiscally of the crisis than in advanced economies where you can get back to growth, you can get your tax bases to grow, and you can, even if the absolute debt level of OECD countries is going to be higher, as a fraction of GDP, it can stabilize, it can drop, and as the economies go back to natural growth. But you don't have that kind of natural growth mechanism in the Gulf, where so much growth is dependent really on the state injecting money into the economy. And of course, this differs a little bit from one economy to the next. So say the economy of Dubai is much less dependent on direct state spending than, say, the economy of Abu Dhabi or Saudi Arabia or Kuwait. If you look at a case like Saudi Arabia, technically there is a large private sector and there's a lot of private demand, but if you look at how the demand is generated, it's actually indirectly through state spending. So if you look at the main income sources of private Saudi households, you'll see that something like 2/3 of that is actually government transfers and government salaries, because the majority of Saudis are employed in the public sector, and the public sector pays better than the private sector. So even private consumer demand indirectly is largely state generated. And that's different again from most OECD economies, where something like 70 or 80% of people work in the private sector, and the salaries there are at least as good typically as in the public sector. So considerably higher state dependence of the private sector economic activity, and a much smaller revenue generation capacity in the taxation system. So it really still is largely an oil-driven story, although there has been quite a bit of diversification. I mean, the one real exemption to that is Dubai, but even there, some of the private demand that comes from neighboring countries is then also dependent on the kind of oil business cycle in those countries. So even Dubai isn't completely independent of oil, even if its immediate government revenue is by and large non-oil. So I think that highlights a couple of things going forward. One is that there's probably a larger likelihood of sort of an L-shaped recovery more than a V-shaped recovery, because the fiscal resources to get back to growth are just permanently reduced unless there's a very significant recovery of oil prices. There's recently been some speculation that so much oil production capacity has been destroyed that there could be a temporary spike of oil price going perhaps temporarily above $100 per barrel, or even up to 150. I think we just don't know. The movements, both in terms of demand destruction and supply destruction, have been very large, and the net effect is very difficult to predict. So that there could be kind of a lucky year or 2 years with very high oil price again, but we can't rely on that. For the time being, the fiscal resources have been reduced, and I mean the impact is a lot more dramatic for the lower income countries, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia. Kuwait, Qatar, and the Emirates are much more cushioned because of smaller populations, larger per capita oil revenue, and larger reserves. But even there'll be less fiscal flexibility going forward. And I think policy-wise, going forward, this means that the transition towards generating non-oil revenue, building a taxation system, building other forms of non-oil revenue is becoming more urgent. But doing that will mean some short to medium term pain. We're seeing right now it's happening in Saudi Arabia, where they tripled the VAT rate to react to the big fiscal gap created by COVID. And that is proving so far to, I mean, we're only 2 weeks into that, but it's proving to be very, very painful to consumers. So informally on social media, a lot of people are complaining, and I expect that indicators of private consumption will be down very, very heavily going forward, because they're taking out something like between a seventh and an eighth of the total purchasing power of Saudi households through that VAT reform. So it's very, very significant. It's necessary probably, but the timing is not very good, and it's going to depress growth for a while going forward. And I think other GCC countries will have to follow. The question is just when and sort of at which rate. There'll probably also lower economic growth for a while, just because the government can't stimulate that much, and private demand generation. So a genuinely private demand that's generated through people earning money in the private sector and that's spending that money in the private sector. This will hopefully gradually mature over time, will become more important, and then make the economies more resilient to fiscal shocks. But this is sort of a long-term, almost secular process that will take a very long time. I think the most urgent policy need going forward is to make fiscal spending more efficient. I think the days of very large stimulus packages are probably gone because of the fiscal constraints that the Gulf is now operating under. I think the real thinking has to go into how can we spend the available resources we have more efficiently. And I think one very large distortion, but also opportunity for fiscal reforms is how money is currently spent on the welfare of citizens. And there we get to the second big point that I want to make, which is the role of government employment and government salary spending. Because in my view, the way that wealth is currently shared with citizen population in the GCC is very heavily reliant on government employment. So in all GCC countries, there's quite strong evidence that governments overemploy citizens. So they employ more citizens than they would need to function sort of efficiently and deliver the public goods and services that they have to deliver. And pretty much ever since the 1970s, government employment has been used as sort of a quasi-welfare mechanism. At least male citizens implicitly have had sort of a guarantee to sooner or later get a government job. Now, this guarantee has been attenuating. There's been a reduced hiring. Even in the Emirates, there's now actually significant graduate unemployment among citizens because the government doesn't hire so generously anymore. Whereas, say, 20 or 30 years ago, anyone sooner or later would have gotten a job, say, in the local police department or something like this. So this kind of social contract is being reduced gradually, but the basic functioning, the basic outline of it is still the same. So the majority of citizens in all countries have a government job rather than a private job, which is very unusual. In the rest of the world, it's more like 70 to 80% of people working in the private sector. Now, this has, in the past, allowed the GCC countries to maintain a pretty broad middle class among its citizens. It's been a pretty effective tool of sharing the wealth, but increasingly it's also been shown to be quite inefficient. So it's been inefficient in the sense that governments become just less effective, less efficient when they overemploy, so bureaucracies don't function as well. And it's also very, very costly. Now, the share of salaries and overall spending in GCC countries, they're somewhere between 40 and 60% of total spending, which is extremely high in international comparison. It's more like 20 to 30% in mature economies, and is also increasingly becoming an unfair and exclusive way of sharing the wealth, because the new generations, as just mentioned, they don't always get these jobs. And when you don't get the government jobs, there's actually not that much by way of modern welfare systems. There's a bit of unemployment assistance or unemployment insurance here or there, but if you don't get the government job, you're kind of not part of the social contract in many ways. So I think the real fiscal challenge going forward is to maintain the social contract, but in a way that's more efficient fiscally, that's less economically distortive, that allows more nationals to be active in the private sector rather than being parked in the public sector, and that is fairer, more inclusive. So everyone, at least all citizens, have access to it. But at the same time, it has to be fiscally more responsible, because sort of an open-ended government employment guarantee is fiscally unsustainable because populations grow, oil income is stagnating, potentially shrinking, or even the UAE going forward can't perpetually guarantee government employment for everyone. And I mean, to be fair, there's a lot of internal discussion to which I've been part to some extent, that the country has to move away from the social contract. There's been a lot of work trying to make young Emiratis more entrepreneurial, more oriented towards the private sector. So the kind of general direction, I think, is very much right. What hasn't been quite figured out yet is how to engineer that move in a way that's socially acceptable. Just taking away the government job guarantee, but providing nothing else in return is very tricky, because then you force nationals to compete in the private sector with foreign work migrants who are willing to work in the kind of low to mid-skill sector, at least at very, very low wages. It's not fair to expect GCC citizens to, say, compete with Indians or Bangladeshis or Pakistanis willing to work for a few $100s a month. So I think the real policy challenge going forward is to push nationals to be more active in the private sector, to reduce the very costly spending on public sector employment, but support nationals in the private sector in a way that they can still have a reasonable middle-class wage. And there would be a range of tools to potentially do that. That would both save money and be kind of socially more inclusive and fairer. It could be something like a negative income tax, like they have it in the United States, the earned income tax credit, where if you earn below a certain threshold, you don't pay taxes to government, but government actually subsidizes your wage. So you have a sliding scale where at very low wages you get a larger subsidy, and this gradually reduces until you reach a level where the subsidy is completely phased out. And that's also used by Singapore, for example. They have kind of a workplace income supplement. So it's not a very interventionist policy. It's very liberal, economically liberal countries using that. And I think in a context like the GCC, where the competition, especially in the lower wage sector with low wage foreign migrants is so acute, the government probably has to step in some way to support its nationals. This is a very unusual situation. If you imagine, say, Germany or France suddenly importing 30 million low-wage migrants from the subcontinent, surely the wage level in the low to mid-skilled segments of the labor market would drop drastically, and suddenly citizens wouldn't be competitive anymore. So it's not something that's unique to the GCC. It's just basic economics when you create that supply of very, very large numbers of low-skilled, low-wage workers. There could be also potentially a move, especially in the GCC countries that have relatively larger fiscal reserves, to an unconditional basic income. You could say that every citizen above the age of 18 just gets a check from government every month, of perhaps in the UAE of a couple of thousand dirhams. But in return, the government says that no, we don't provide a government employment guarantee anymore. This is our basic welfare. Everyone has basic livelihood, but if you want to earn more than that, you have to actually go out, be entrepreneurial, find a private sector job, or start a company. That would be an alternative, or perhaps a complement to a kind of wage subsidy arrangement. I think that the basic message is that whatever the tools that you use to generate a new social contract, the COVID crisis has increased the need for fundamental fiscal reforms, for fundamental distributional reforms, for re-engineering the social contract in the GCC. And it has increased the need to shift national populations towards private sector activity away from very expensive government employment. So I think this is, even if the individual policy ideas that I floated might not make much sense, I think this is the broad direction in which the discussion has to go. And probably it'll be the lower income countries, so Bahrain, Saudi, and Oman, that have to experiment with those kinds of mechanisms very soon. So I think I'll stop right here, and I'm sure I get a lot of pushback on some of the things that I said in the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen, for shedding light on the cost benefit of the fiscal policies. You raised some interesting points here, how the fiscal policy and the structure would be different here in the case of the GCC, given that there is no taxation and the relative big size of the public sector. And of course, you mentioned some benefit in terms of the Keynesian multiplier, and the fact that that could be a mechanism in which would you be able to recover all of your stimulus, fiscal stimulus packages, and which is the case in most OECD countries. These are some insight that we probably would look into it, and other also very important issues that you have addressed. Would like to thank you very much, Dr. Stephen. And I would like now to turn the microphone to our speaker, Dr. Abhishek Saurav, economist at the World Bank, for his lecture on structural policy, development infrastructure, and preparation for the post-COVID era. Dr. Saurav is economist, private sector development and investment climate at the World Bank Group, and he will be examining the structural policy, development of the structure, and preparation of the post-COVID-19 era. Welcome, Dr.
Good morning, good afternoon. I hope you can hear me well and see the presentation that I'm now just projecting. My name is Abhishek Saurav. I'm an economist at the World Bank Group. My views that I'm sharing in this presentation are strictly personal, although I make liberal use of evidence that is available commonly on the internet, some from the World Bank and some elsewhere. So I think we've already spoken about some aggressive monetary policy stance that has been adopted by policymakers, the landscape of creative fiscal policy measures. So, I mean, I want to build on the unusual aspect of this of the crisis. So it's unusual in many ways, right? There's historic reference, if one could look at that, is we are looking at a recession, a global recession, which affects more than 90% of global economies. So more than 90% of countries around the world are currently or projected to be in recession in 2020. And I think if you look at the last 150 years, the graphic that you see on the screen, it tells you the magnitude of the problem, the prevalence of the problem. So this recession is not just more prevalent, it's also more deep. So we know that recent World Bank estimates show that the global economy is estimated to contract by over 5%, which would be the highest contraction since the Second World War, so 8 decades now. And this is a problem, right? Because let's look at the inception of this problem. So what began as an outbreak in central China in an aspiring transportation hub, within a span of 6 to 8 months now, has transformed into a global pandemic, inflicting systemic shocks both on the supply side and the demand side. So just to unpack this a little more, on the supply side, we see that the limits on collective production and the shortages of labor which have been imposed by restrictions on movement have essentially meant that there is underutilized capacity across the world. Well, of course, most of this is in advanced economies, but I think a similar scenario is faced by emerging economies as well. On the demand side, we have seen that there is a marked shift in consumer behavior, right? And not just behavior in what we consume and what we can consume. There are limits to collective consumption, especially in the services and entertainment sector. That's just not possible. So that shift has been imposed on consumers, but there's also change in consumer preferences. So there's looking for substitutes of the things that they used to be normal consumption. Now we are looking for substitutes and changing preferences based on what is available in the market. In addition to that, so that's at the individual and household level, right? But in addition to that, what is happening is because of the effects on production, upstream firms are no longer demanding the demand gap that is left vacant by upstream firms. They don't need the suppliers and the small medium enterprises who used to be part of their productive linkages, the networks, the suppliers. So it's a systemic shock from all aspects, both demand and supply sides of the economy. What I want to focus on is how this impacts. So we know that this translates into loss of livelihoods and incomes across the globe. But I would like to rather focus on the developing country where these vulnerabilities were already quite magnified, and the pandemic has put into sharp relief the enhanced vulnerabilities of socially excluded groups, women, youth, and several other population groups that are now facing almost certain loss of income and livelihood. Just to motivate this problem, so we know that informality, the aspect of businesses and workers operating in the informal sector, the unorganized sector, is quite high in the developing world. Some estimates show that it's as high as about 70 to 80%. So 70 to 80% of businesses are informal. which means that they're not really visible from in any interventionist sense, not visible to government policymakers, which means that they cannot be delivered the types of support measures that would have been available to them if they were visible, formal, and registered. Now that translates into some problems for people who work in the informal sector. And that is, so we know that globally, the employment estimates in the informal sector is in excess of 2 billion individuals. And more than 1.5 billion of those individuals, recent ILO estimates suggest, are facing loss of livelihood and income. So a long way to say that the vulnerabilities that existed in the pre-COVID world have been laid bare and further magnified and deepened in the last 6 to 8 months because of the pandemic. Moving to the next slide. So on this slide, I want to contrast the near term and the long term. So whatever I have spoken till now, the examples that I've cited are near-term effects. The vulnerability in terms of job losses, incomes, supply and demand shocks, those have already been registered, and there's a lot of evidence, empirical evidence for us to come to terms with it. But in the long run, there are certain risks that we need to be aware of. So we see that in the longer run, there is falling investor confidence. So business investments are stagnant. There's a reason why investments do not materialize in an environment of uncertainty and risk. The reason is that, so there's an option value of waiting, of just waiting it out. And we don't know, with no knowledge of how long the pandemic is going to bear out and when possible recovery is in sight, investors are most likely to adopt this wait and see kind of a stance, which is a problem for businesses, because for growth you need capital. There's also a simultaneous decline in human capital. And on one of the further slides, I'll talk more about this. But the idea is that, so most of us are aware of the disruption to normal schooling and education institutions that we see because of, again, collective consumption, collective delivery of education and services is just not possible. And because of that, we see that there is a shock to human capital accumulation. Now, this is important because over the last 3 to 4 decades, the gains that have been made in the developing world in terms of human capital accumulation by making education more accessible and more equitable have now very quickly in the last 6 to 8 months are being affected in a way that recovery may take longer than the short term. And then there is global trade and commerce. So we know that global trade and commerce activity is already significantly down. Some estimates show that maybe about 1/4 of that activity would be down, but some recent numbers suggest that the effect is more modest, which is a positive sign. But the idea with global trade and commerce is that global trade has delivered on development. It has delivered on equality. It has delivered on higher wages. It has brought much needed good jobs to people and to people in the developing world. And I think for those reasons, these kind of macro trends of human capital, global trade, and stagnating investments are the ones to really watch out for long-term recovery. So the long-term risk, just to mention it very clearly, is that even if a potential recovery is in sight, and the chances of an ensuing financial crisis are averted, we are still looking at 2 major vulnerabilities, that is slowing growth, muted growth. Now, of course, estimates differ, whether you're looking at developing countries or the advanced economies, and even within developing countries, there's a lot of heterogeneity on that. And the other thing is the problem of productivity growth. The productivity growth problem is that, at least in advanced economies, it has been stagnating in the last few decades. And the risk is that productivity growth will stagnate more broadly, both in developing and advanced economies. And these are the two problems to watch out for. Now, having made clear the two problems that I want to focus on, I think that's where this is the entry point for structural reforms. Now, the structural reform should address the kind of basic fundamentals of production capacity, investor confidence, how to avert a financial crisis so that a long-term decline in output is averted. On the productivity side, there are certain vulnerabilities related to human capital, labor force, inefficient and low investment in supply chain disruptions. Those type of things are kind of to be taken in view. I think the menu is really long. In today's presentation, I want to focus on three areas which I think need to be addressed on priority. And these respond kind of squarely to the weaknesses, structural weaknesses that have come about or evident during the crisis. So again, in the developing country context, we have seen that the existing vulnerabilities of poor, substandard healthcare systems, the weaknesses have been quite evident, made evident because of COVID-19. We know that these healthcare systems, which were not very sturdy to begin with, have felt overstretched and in many cases failing to attend to the pandemic and its needs. In terms of informality, because certain businesses are not visible, governments have not been able to reach them, and that reveals a successive problem of joblessness because in the informal economy. For informal workers especially, the choice has been poor, because on one hand, because of the subsistence nature of those livelihoods, it's important to continue to work in the absence of government program support measures. But at the same time, the other choice is, and if you can't do that because of health reason and because of the pandemic, then it almost means certain loss of livelihood. And I think this choice architecture is unfair. I think it puts into contrast the vulnerabilities of those who work in the informal sector. This is in the billions of dollars, by the way, just for magnitude of effect. The next problem is of SMEs. So we know that small and medium enterprises have been kind of the backbone of employment, production in developing economies. But I think the pandemic and the economic fallout of the pandemic has kind of made clear that liquidity is a major severe constraint. Not just that it is very difficult to serve SMEs. There's certain problems, structural problems here, right? So there's this lack of access to bank lending, especially at good rates. And there's certain information asymmetries where information and knowledge does not transmit well between financial institutions, the government, and SMEs. And I think these are structural problems that need to be addressed so that SMEs are more resilient. And finally, the one on human capital, because of the lack and overall secular decline in education activities across different levels, and the loss of workplace training opportunities and vocational training opportunities has led to this crisis of human capital. So in response to these weaknesses, I think there are certain policies there's a convergence on ideas amongst policymakers, economists, and public sector specialists on what should be done to pave the way for a recovery. And the first consensus that is emerging is around strengthening health systems. And this could be done a variety of ways. I have tried to simplify this in terms of raising healthcare quality by improving general healthcare provision, which is a challenge in the developing world. The prevalence of specialized services, diagnostics, surgical, emergency in terms of provision in lagging regions, and investing in healthcare education and training. And this is both on the supply side and the demand side. We're looking both at the workforce and also looking at the population where sanitation and other programs have to be raised, elevated in the priority. The second is around building capacity. building healthcare capacity, which is to provide access to routine and emergency medical services for all, irrespective of region, whether you are in urban agglomerations or in lagging regions. This has to be, the pandemic has made evident that nobody is insulated from the risk of such an outbreak, and hence capacity should respond to be prepared for such an eventuality. And the other problem is that despite having healthcare infrastructure, workforce and staffing seems to be a serial problem in developing countries. Something needs to be done in terms of filling those gaps in workforce and staffing in the developing world. And the third area for strengthening health systems is to boost preparedness. One of the good things that we saw coming out from how different countries have dealt with this pandemic is those countries where there were national, regional emergency preparedness plans and epidemic strategies have been able to fare better in crisis. And I think this presents a good example of the utility of such planning. It is important to stress test your health system to make sure that there are viable plans that the health system is able to cope during a pandemic such as this or other type of emergency or natural disaster event. The second area, structural area I want to talk about is private sector development. So I briefly touched upon the problem. The solution in terms of sustaining informal workers in firms is to provide income support to informal workers, especially women. We know that in the informal sector, women are disproportionately more likely to be employed as compared to men, and hence we need to extend that sustenance support to those informal workers, keeping in mind that this disproportionately affects women, and then in turn households. We also need to be looking at the fundamental and age-old question of why firms choose or remain informal. Such a large majority of firms remain informal in developing countries. And we need to look at the incentives of formalization. What is it? I mean, preparing a package of reforms that incentivizes informal firms to transcend the boundary of formalization. This could be done by effective contract enforcement, ensuring legal protections to formal firms and property rights, the kind of suite of reforms that affect formalization at the extensive and intensive margin. Then the second area of work is on SME finance. So some short-term measures are quite evident these days. I think in policy circles, we already see the prevalence and effectiveness of low interest rate lines of credit, broad-based subsidies, grants that counter the liquidity crunch in the short term, but at the same time, make sure that these are extended in the longer term if the pandemic sustains, so that it is also a resource to be used to fuel recovery. Recognizing the fact that most of the savings and reserves in private sector firms, especially small and medium firms, would have been eroded by the time a possible recovery is in sight. So they will not just need sustenance, they will also need fueling of the recovery. And third area, I think some would argue the most important area would be regulatory reforms. With the pandemic, I think we have seen the limits of traditional business regulations, labor regulations, and the rules of the game. I think the pandemic has made quite clear that old rules of the game are not fit for purpose for the new world. So I think this is a call for regulatory flexibility. There has to be a concerted effort in relaxing labor and business regulations to reduce business costs. We need to be able to foster contestable markets evenly throughout the developing world, as it is in the advanced economies, and probably there as well. To support recovery, there's also a good case for reforms that enhance allocative efficiency, reforms that boost competition, so competition policies in developing countries, those that relate to new labor regulations, health regulations to respond to the changing nature of the world of work, where more and more people are working from remote locations, some mostly from home, but can be other places as well, to serve the private sector a regulatory package that supports the nature of businesses being conducted and be fit for purpose for the next century. So I think that's what I would say on regulatory reforms. The third broad area of structural policies, I think, should focus on human capital. So the first is clearly on access to education. So although there have been great strides that have been made in the last 3 to 4 decades in ensuring enhanced access at the primary and secondary levels, we need to enhance education access for all peoples, irrespective of gender, social groups, communities, lagging regions or agglomerations, to have access to human capital enhancing vocational training, human capital enhancing tertiary education as well, good quality. And I think that segues nicely into the next point, is that the focus going forward has to be on investing in people. And investing in people is important because we know that one of the fallouts, clearly, I think the first presentation highlighted that using the case of United States, is that there's this massive increase in joblessness. And then if joblessness is happening because of structural reasons, certain services sectors are not being able to sustain workforce that we have seen, services being the mainstay, has been a significant job creator, if you think about it that way. We need joblessness programs that translate the joblessness problem through retooling and reskilling programs so that we can meet the skill demands of the future. There are certain sectors that we know, research suggests, are on the upswing. We know healthcare services, healthcare infrastructure, digital services, and several others for which a certain extent of retooling and reskilling is needed. And I think investing in people should take the form of those type of programs. And finally, I want to pause for a moment to think about this in the bigger context. So naturally, there's no doubt that the pandemic has inflicted a blow on the global economy that we have not seen before. It is going to probably take several years, if not decades, to come out of this, of the crisis and its aftermath. But I think this is also an opportunity, and I think we have seen growing consensus, at least in the development community, that to view this as an opportunity to build back better, build back greener, more inclusive, and smarter. What do we mean by that? What we mean is that in the policy stance that we adopt in terms of coping with the pandemic, we need to make sure that future investments and business priorities are aligned with sustainability, environmental sustainability. Let us look more closely at energy efficiency, these sectors of the economy that deal with that, conservation of natural forest land, identifying clean energy solutions and making them affordable for the masses, and sustainable transportation solutions to decrease the global carbon footprint on the economy of human activity. So that's on the building back greener. The second priority, and I think equally important, if not more, is to build back more inclusive. We need to be able to make a priority to reduce vulnerabilities of women and excluded social groups to economic shocks. This pandemic has made evident, and if you look at the unemployment numbers and forecast, you know that the effect has been disproportionately more on youth, on women, on people on the lower skill trajectory. And we need to be able to fill those gaps so that we make those population groups which are significant as a share more resilient to economic shock and also promote equality and economic empowerment. And I think the third principle has to be to build back smarter. And by smarter, I mean leveraging technology. To foster a digital economy that boosts shared prosperity, equality, by closing the digital divide. We know that in certain parts of the developing world, internet access is intermittent, it is not equitable, it is not of good quality. And hence we need to be, and that is an infrastructure investment that will pay dear dividends in the near future. So I think that is an infrastructure investment that has to be prioritized. And there are many good sides of it. So one of the early payoffs of this can be, it can instantly, as soon as we have access, improve government to business and government to citizen service delivery. The pandemic has made kind of that, because of the limitations on collective production and consumption, it has made that a necessity. But even before the pandemic, this was identified as an area of improvement. I think the pandemic has placed it as a top priority to be able to deliver government services to its people, to businesses more effectively, at low cost, more equitably. So with that, I think I've exhausted the time that was allocated to me. I'm happy to take any more questions and engage in the discussion. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mahmoud.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Saurav. I mean, this was really enlightening. It was very interesting in terms of the perspective you brought into the scope of the structural policies that are available, that are most needed in the post-COVID world, and specifically the impacts, the emphasis on the private sectors, on the regulatory frameworks, and as well as what are the new policy priorities should be in terms and where are the new opportunities are lying. I would like now to turn the microphone to our speaker, Mr. Muhammad Hamdawi, Resident Fellow and Economic Researchers at the Economic Department, at Economic Studies Department at Trend Research Advisory, to shed light on the role of government spending and stimulus scientific and medical R&D under COVID-19. Mr. Hamdawi.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud. I'm really very happy to join such a great panel. It's a pleasure to join you in this conversation. My talk won't have slides, just as Dr. Hertog did, and I'll be trying to talk about the role of the government in promoting R&D spend, scientific and medical R&D spend. But let me just start by putting some background on my conversation here. As all of you guys said, there is definitely an unprecedented situation that the world that we are facing. And we've seen a plethora of stimulus packages implemented across many countries to support citizens, companies of different sizes and economic activity through these difficult times. I don't think we have seen anything of this scale and breadth in terms of spend to promote and to support economies through these difficult times. I guess I would use one sentence that one of my friends says that under exceptional circumstances, only exceptional measures work. I guess the same applies to scientific and medical R&D activities, research and development activities, and in general to the R&D industry, which needs support to mitigate the effects of this crisis. Let me start maybe by putting things into context for this conversation. So before we get into the conversation around the role of government spending in supporting R&D activities, let me just maybe talk a little bit about the R&D industries as I define as all the effort that goes into developing research and development within the government sector, within universities, within research entities, and within the private sector, which is still the most important contributor to R&D activities. R&D activities are very important contributor to the national economies, whether now or in the future. It's probably going to be even more important in the future as we move to an economy that is based on knowledge and innovation. And I'm just want to cite one example here. In the US, if you look at some of the major research universities, they are actually amongst the largest employers in their respective states and contribute greatly to the local economy. The Institute for Research and Innovation, Research on Innovation and Science, said basically that US universities spent about $14 billion on goods and services related to research in the fiscal year 2018 and 2019, 18 to 19. And in 44 states in the US, a research university is amongst the top 5 employers. So it is an important sector within the economy now. And as I said, it will become even more important as we move towards a global economy based on knowledge and innovation. And I guess it's going to become more important for government to develop a national integrated R&D strategy that is centered around science and innovation, and quite frankly, increase spending on capital expenditure. I'm going to get to that in a little bit around the fact that a lot of countries are not spending as much as they set their goals in terms of spending on R&D activities. And they need to spend R&D capital on all the sectors. You see a lot of focus has happened, because of the pandemic, because of what's happening, a lot of focus has been on COVID-19 related R&D activities, but going forward, hopefully when we get this crisis behind us, then the countries need to have a much more balanced approach and focus on different sectors of the economy. I think that maybe the next point is around the structure of the R&D industry and how R&D activities are financed, just so we can understand the importance of the governments, different governments. But as I said before, research and development and research in general are conducted within government entities. In the US, for example, Department of Energy and the National Institutes of Health have their own facilities and conduct their own research programs within those facilities, as well as support universities through grants and third parties through competitive bids for research programs that they finance, but they don't do themselves. Universities are another major and important component of the R&D industry within the US and across the globe. That's where a lot of new ideas are being developed. All the different masters and doctorate and postdoctorate students doing all those research programs. And then the private sector plays a much bigger role in terms of R&D. And the private sector, whether they're R&D focused companies, small size, SMEs, or large corporations spending considerable amount on R&D activities. According to a report by the OECD, 60% of all R&D expenditure within OECD countries is undertaken by businesses in the private sector. That's an important element to consider as policymakers think about how to support the activities around research and development and how they set policies that will promote and help and support those small and big companies. And again, as I said, it's spread across the private sector. The majority of the activity happen in this big, well-financed, small kind of number of large companies, but SMEs still represent around 35% of the R&D expenditure within the private sector on average within the OECD countries, and that range varies. So ultimately, when we're talking about supporting the SMEs, generally, R&D, those that are involved in developing new ideas, conducting new research will eventually get supported by those policies that apply to all the SMEs. But I would argue later that they need to get a bit more support and focus, because their needs may be slightly different. In terms of financing, the government spend, through their own appropriation and spending, they spend capital within their own entities. They provide grants to universities. They provide loans. They have bidding processes to give research programs to third parties. But as I said, most importantly, it's through own capital from the private sector. These are the companies that spend their own money on R&D activities. And I think I would like just to say, maybe take a step back here and talk a little bit about, we talk about, the title of this talk is around the medical and the scientific research, and pharma is the largest or the most R&D intensive industry, followed by the ICT, so technology and computer and information. And Dr. Sourav talks about efficiency and how maybe we need to think about the future. I think we've seen some industries now stepping up because of like the auto industry, where we were seeing an increase in R&D spend because they're looking at more efficiency, new improvement in efficiency through technology and research development and through automation. So in general now, the auto industry is amongst the top 10 industries in terms of R&D spend. So this is kind of just the background to set kind of the stage for the conversation, and talk a little bit about the importance of the R&D activities and industry within national economies. So now if we turn our attention to what happened over the last few months, as the pandemic hit, there was large amounts of money, as I would say, have been thrown at COVID-19 related research across all sectors. So we've seen a lot of money spent on clinical research, development of vaccines, development of models to predict future pandemics, resilience and crisis readiness, etc., etc. So the other sectors in the R&D industry have actually been affected by this pandemic in a similar way. I would argue that other sectors of the economy. So while the attention has been given rightly to finding a solution to this pandemic across all the different sectors, other parts of the R&D industry have been affected. Social distancing rules, closure of facilities, suspension of work, and programs that had to be shut down are just few examples of what R&D sectors faced over the last few months. As I said, if you're doing research and working with live animals or working with organic, I'm not a doctor or an epidemiologist, but working on viruses and bacteria, and you have to shut down your program, it's going to be difficult to restart. And so if you look at it as an industry, it has been affected in the same manner as most of the other economic sectors. There's another element which I think is important as well, is the redirection of all these efforts and budgets towards COVID-related research, in a sense, has reduced the availability of capital, I guess, if you want to call it that way, to other sectors of the R&D. And then ultimately, as the governments spend money on the stimulus programs, they probably would have to balance their budgets one way or the other, and ultimately there will be budget cuts for some of the government entities that would eventually hurt other R&D programs in the future. So I guess it's the big question, maybe for me as I was doing this paper, is to look how would government, who are finding ways to support medical research in an unprecedented way, with the focus on COVID-19, keep the momentum and use this experience to define a long-term strategy to support R&D in the future. I guess there's one maybe element to mention here is when we were faced with the SARS pandemic, there were the same flurry of projects looking at different aspects of that pandemic and doing a lot from different aspects, but a lot of those projects were simply abandoned when the virus was under control. So once the pandemic ended, we stopped. I think the argument is that if we spent and continue to spend a lot of research on viruses, for instance, we could probably be much better off now dealing with the pandemic. So if as I mentioned before, governments are responsible for about 40% of R&D expenditure within the OECD countries. And that's where the majority of R&D activities take place anyway. So these governments need to make sure that spending is within the targets they set for themselves and try to shield the R&D budgets from cuts. You know, I looked at a report that says that European countries were not on track to achieve their targets of spending 3% of their GDP on R&D, and only got to 2.1% in 2017. And only 4 countries achieved the objectives of attending 3%. And a lot of that was actually thanks to the private sector. And I'm not sure how, you know, we have a panel of great economists that maybe could answer that question, but how would, one thing government should do is to insulate R&D expenditure from the fluctuation in national budgets and balance the decline in the private sector spend on R&D caused by the recent pandemic. So how can the government make sure that they set budgets that they're not gonna take away when things get difficult? Also, as I mentioned, SMEs are responsible for a considerable share of the R&D activities and need support of government through these stimulus packages. The share, as I said, is about 30%, 35% for the OECD countries. I think, and as I said, although the SMEs, whether they're in the R&D sector or they don't do much R&D, would benefit in the same manner. But I think several countries have earmarked budgets specifically to support R&D activities caused, amid this pandemic. In the US, the CARES Act that was passed in March, it appropriated more than $1 billion to support R&D activities specifically, and also about $14 billion allocation to support higher education. I think that 14 billion is probably gonna, I think a lot of it, or half of it probably would go into supporting students, but the money left, part of it will definitely go into supporting activities, including countering the effects of the pandemic on research activities. So these universities have to pay salaries of this students or postdoctoral students. They have to make sure that when they restart the operation, they have the right equipments and supplies to actually recover and go back to their activities. So there's a lot of noise in the background. Can you guys just put yourself on mute? Also in the US still, last week, the Congress proposed an increase to the budget for R&D across many federal entities. I think the NIH and the DOE will get the largest share of this increase, and there's around 11 billion in additional funding that will be given to those two entities in order to promote R&D and make sure that major R&D projects that are critical are still able to continue. These new laws or acts are also include the ability to allow agencies for more flexibility. What I mean here is, if you're familiar with the US process for grants to universities and proposals to the government, they are very cumbersome when it comes to admin requirements. So this law is allowing for more flexibility, and so postponement of deadlines, special guidelines for award, reductions in the paperwork required, reduction in terms of audits and whatnot. So basically making sure that whatever research is ongoing right now, it's done without too much difficulty for the universities. There's another example I would give here. It's the UK set aside.
Mr. Hamdawi, can you please speed up, because I think we have a time limit.
Okay.
And that's very interesting.
Sure. I'll do my best here. Maybe 3 more minutes, 5 more minutes. How much?
Okay. Okay. Yeah, 3 more minutes. Okay.
3 more minutes. That's gonna. Okay. Let me do that in 3 more minutes. So I said the UK set aside 280 million in financial aid to universities, support researchers' salaries, professional costs, and make sure that the higher priority R&D projects are maintained. So we don't want to stop key projects that are happening right now because of the pandemic and the effects on the universities. And the UK government as well announced 400 million pounds for R&D through 7 projects across the UK to boost local economies. And it includes several sectors: communication, 5G, innovative vehicles, and medical devices. And if you look through the literature, there are so many other countries that are specifically earmarking money for the maintenance of key research and development projects, because that's, as I said, that's what's going to set those countries apart in the future. I would personally say that all these efforts will provide great support to R&D activities, but I guess they need to morph into a well-defined integrated national strategy to support R&D across all sectors, as I said before. And most importantly, just make sure, ensure alignments between the public, the private, and academic entities, and while making sure that conflicts of interest are managed. It also needs to provide the needed financing and research for research institutions, simplify the process of awards, and to reduce the administrative burden on universities and grant recipients, and also, I'd say, have a research program that is driven by science and not by the politics of the hour. I'll conclude quickly for the sake of time. R&D activities are critical to the economic prosperity of countries now and in the future. As we move to a knowledge-based economy, government play a major role in conducting, facilitating, and financially supporting the R&D activities, and need to continue to do so in the future. And we should not forget that SMEs contribute a considerable share of the R&D expenditure and need to be given more support. And I guess finally, the flurry of support to COVID-19 related R&D need to be translated into a long-term strategy to support scientific and medical research. Thank you, Mahmoud.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hamdawi. Thank you for your interesting lecture and for shedding light on the R&D spend in healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and other emerging technology and research institution-centered R&D. Okay. I would like now to turn the microphone to our speaker, chair of the Bachelor Program on Security and Strategic Study at the American University of the Emirates, and former economic advisor to the Inter-American Development Bank, to elaborate on COVID-19 stimulus program and government spending, comparison and application in highly industrialized and periphery country. Welcome, Dr. Constantin.
Good evening to everyone. Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Mahmoud Sharif. Thank you also to Trends Research for allowing me to participate in this panel. I think it has been quite an interesting panel, but I believe it will be interesting also for us to try to contrast how these stimulus packages and programs have operated in different environments, in different countries. And for that reason, I believe it will be precise for us to try to take into account or to try to analyze some of these stimulus packages, at least in 4 or 5 cases. For that reason, I would like to first grasp perhaps the main features of those stimulus programs in countries like in the United States, but as well many different countries like in China, as well as in Brazil, as well as in Colombia, in South America, which is where I come from. And later on, I want just to give some reflections and some concerns to the panel, also open questions, so that perhaps we can a little bit analyze or grasp with more realism what we are experiencing. As well, it will be included in the United Arab Emirates, absolutely. Okay, so for doing that, I will start just by sharing my screen. So one moment, please. Okay. Well, the title of the presentation, I know that I have about 15 minutes, is COVID-19 Economic Stimulus Programs and Government Spending, Comparisons and Implications in Highly Industrialized and Periphery Countries. I want to warn also that these are my personal views for the economic stimulus programs, requirements and challenges on the E-Symposium of Trends Research. These are not the views of the institution I'm working with. Okay, so to begin with, I think it will be important for us to take a very close look at the stimulus program in the United States. The CARES Act, as you can see, provides for economic impact, direct payments to different sectors of American households, in some cases for up to $1,200 per adult. In some cases also where those individuals are less than 99,000 and 500 per child under 17 years old, or up to 3,000, even up to 3,400 for a family of four. This has been, of course, the main stimulus program implemented by the Trump administration back in March 27, 2020. It was signed. And the question that I want to raise here is to which extent is it possible to assess the effectiveness of this package, of this program, especially taking into account that they are considering initiating very soon the KIBUS stimulus program, and which is also for up to $3 trillion for, they say, different struggling American workers. This, as far as I'm concerned, also it's very interesting considering the decline of the American economy as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, since it is very similar than that of the Chinese economy. Of course, it will be very difficult for us to try to assess the reality of the Chinese numbers. But as far as markets are concerned, while there is a decrease of about 5%, perhaps later Dr. Patrick Lane can help us on those numbers. In the decline of the American economy, it is quite clear that the Chinese economy is growing something like 5-6% during the similar period of time. The distribution, as we have been pretty much taking a look at, is precisely directly, especially to the one hand, some individuals, some households, in some cases large corporations, and some of which also includes airlines and others, some for small businesses, and some distribution for the state and local government. It is quite interesting also that, for instance, the amount directed for public health is relatively small. It's about $153 billion from the complete package. And then we have just a small amount for safety nets and safety nets networks. I think these numbers are also very interesting to take into account if we try to analyze what the impact has been over the unemployment rate in the United States. Because to which extent we can assess if it has been really a solution for that social situation currently pressing a substantial part of the population in the country. And especially this is relevant taking into account the upcoming new stimulus package of the Trump administration, which is somehow surrounding the same number that in the first stimulus program. So those are questions that I want to raise to the panel. I think perhaps later we can just take a discussion on that. Moreover, I believe it is important to take into account this discussion since what we are experiencing right now is precisely an exceptional circumstance derived from a security bio threat like the pandemic of COVID-19. And unfortunately, it looks like the numbers in the case of the United States are not really matching with the effort of the central government in order to overcome the consequences of the pandemic. So we can look forward in the coming weeks, if it is possible, maybe for the American health system to overcome the threshold, which is putting that much pressure into the population and the overall health system of the United States or not. And of course, if we can perhaps sort of notice some strong inefficiencies from the American market or not. I think those are some of the open questions for the panel. Okay, we are all familiar with this graph. It's just an unprecedented rise in the unemployment rate, so it will be up to 6 million, 7 million right now. Perhaps Dr. Patrick Lane also can answer to us later if we can experience or we can somehow relate the current unprecedented rise in unemployment with any inefficiencies, both of the market as well as the distribution of the stimulus program of the American government. The next one I want to raise attention to is the case of Brazil. Brazil has been in charge of the economy of Brazil has been in charge of the Ministry of Economy, Mr. Paulo Guedes. The stimulus package was announced in a similar way than that of the United States. It was just about $150 billion. Really a very, very small amount, especially taking into account the size of the Brazilian economy for a pandemic that has not been treated very well as well in Brazil, at least according to the recent data of the
Dr. Castanda, can you please raise your voice? You have a very interesting presentation, and everybody wants to listen to it. And could you raise your voice a little bit?
Thank you. Well, absolutely. I will just try to reach a little bit more my life. Okay. So as I was just saying, the date at which these stimulus programs were presented in Brazil is very similar than that date for the case of the United States. The volume of the funds includes measures such as perhaps loosening fiscal targets of the Brazilian economy. They are expecting perhaps a forecasted deficit of $25 billion by the end of the year. Also, there is some segments for helping the most deprived or vulnerable population in Brazil, and some salary allowances, some relaxations of labor laws to maintain jobs, pays for self-employed workers, and many other measures like that. As well as we can know, just like in the case of the United States, support for small and medium-sized companies. The level of the effect over the economy of Brazil has been quite very similar, like in the case of the United States, about 5, 6, or even 7% of the estimated economic growth rate that Brazil has been experiencing during the last years. But somehow, for the case of Brazil, even unfortunately, if we compare the numbers and compare with the United States, we can see that they are just overcoming the peak of the pandemic. So they are just trying to recover, but certainly the numbers are very big. As you can see, they are around 20 to 40,000 daily cases. We are all familiar that in the case of the United States, those numbers perhaps double or triple the numbers of Brazil up here. And nobody says there will be a new outbreak in the upcoming future. So I think that should be taken into account, of course. And I think that's also part of the economics of those countries. Okay. So let's take a closer look, a short look perhaps at the case of China. The amount is something like 4 trillion yuan, which is $500-600 billion, the stimulus package. Different policies have been implemented. At this point, I think it's important to take into account that in my assessment, it will be perhaps not very recommendable, not very reasonable to just generalize the stimulus package or economic policy among different jurisdictions. I think for the case of China, we can somehow assume that they have to try to present themselves internationally as some sort of centralized or state capitalism. But somehow, if we can try to analyze the way in which they try to tackle the epidemic, we can pretty much compare that they have at least with information they try to present to the public. The results have been a little bit superior. In any case, during the 2020, they have been somehow able to maintain the exchange rate between the yuan and the US dollar. And it looks at least that for the coming future, at least for the second half of the 2020 year, it will be just maintained like that. Before the outbreak, China, as we all know, had already cut the top tier of the value-added tax in some of the top-tier cities. That rate went to 13% to 16% in April 2019. It also raised the threshold for personal income tax by something like 1,000 or 2,000 yuan. That's $200 to $700 per month in January 2019, as well as many other tax deductions for childcare, elderly care, some medical expenditure. And there is also a very strong tax cut that amounted something like $320 billion that goes back even from 2019. So what's the point here? When we speak about economic measures, we also have to try to measure the efficiency of those economic measures, because it's not the capacity of the economy to continue business as usual. And it's the effect of a global pandemic, and this is just part of the equation. And as we can see, at least with the information shared by China, things have somehow been managed differently from February or March to this date. So let's wait and see how things evolve for the rest of the year. And I think this is also important, taking into account precisely the similar growth depressions with different pandemic trends, especially in comparison to China's GDP growth quarterly for the quarterly period in 2020. We see somehow like a depression of 5%. Which is now perhaps 6.8 up to 7%, and in the case of the United States, 4.85%. We have here also to take into account that part of that depression for the case of China comes from the different commercial tensions between the Trump administration and the Prime Minister of China. So it's not just related to the pandemic. And as such, perhaps these numbers about the similar growth depression are telling us another reality about the way in which the country has managed the economy and the pandemic during these recent months. So this is, I think, part also of this discussion. Just finalizing, we have also the case of the United Arab Emirates. It has been somehow during the central bank launched about 100 billion comprehensive economic support scheme in dirhams that will be about $400 billion as of March 2020. And there are also different similar programs. Dubai has its own similar programs that will be something like $400,000 billion in this case. In the case of the United Arab Emirates, the government it's allowing banks to free the regulatory capital buffers. This is very interesting, especially if you compare the policies implemented in some other Western countries. In this case, the United Arab Emirates try to point out directly to the financial system. They expect also to continue and to ensure to pay the dirham in relation to the US dollar. And I think this was also a compromise initiated just a few months ago. And perhaps that's the long-term strategy of the United Arab Emirates, to try to ensure security to international markets. Dubai has also the cancellation of about 50,000 bank guarantee or cash required to undertake custom clearance activities, and Abu Dhabi has also implemented their own stimulus programs. Nonetheless, it's important also to consider that these stimulus programs will go hand in hand with the capacity of the central government to manage the outbreak of the pandemic. And here, at least, I am precisely participating in this conversation with all of you from Dubai. So it looks like grasping or controlling for the government the first outbreak of the pandemic was a central priority, and pretty much we are experiencing 2 to 3 to perhaps even 400 cases just per day, but are far below than those cases experienced in many countries of the Western Hemisphere. And it has been up to 1 week in which the government has again opened borders, and they are just going ahead with trying to open the country for tourism. So let's wait and see. Okay. Finally, we have a very peculiar case, which is that of Colombia. Very short fiscal spending, something like 30 billion pesos, which is million of million, something like just 9.10 billion dollars. And it could be in comparison one of the countries that has spent the least in comparison with many other countries, especially, for instance, with the case of the the United States in values relative to the gross domestic product, even with Peru, Chile, Brazil, and Mexico. At the beginning, it was possible to try to control the pandemic. There have been different tensions between the central government and the administration of the capital city in Bogota, so that, and unfortunately, it looks like the upcoming scenario is quite complex, and it will be necessary to try to increase lockdown measures and to try to treat the pandemic in an already very weak economic environment back in the country. Okay. So saying that, and considering that I believe it will be also the end of my time, I want to thank all of you, and I want just to raise a few questions here for the panel, which I believe are valid. The first one will be, I believe stimulus programs should also be assessed in relation with the impact derived from the economic effects for the pandemic in the population. Stimulus programs cannot be separated from the population itself. Not even from the political system.
Can we speed up a little bit? Of the time? Okay.
Second, government and stimulus programs cannot be considered just in gross values. Effects derived rely extensively on the capacity of the health system to overcome the systemic threshold of the pandemic, as well as to assess the probability of upcoming outbreaks, which I think part of the topic that we should be discussing here. In the case of the United States, exceptional monetary circumstances could help the country, but social indicators such as unemployment claims keep on raising questions about the real social situation. Are those inefficiencies considered in economic terms? And just poor performance of some countries raise questions, especially amidst potential upcoming outbreaks that they were directed to alleviate the economy or to relax the market. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. René Casanda, for your very informative lecture and shedding lights on the stimulus packages and the difference between industrialized and periphery economy. And now would like to turn the session into the questions. We have several questions here. Let me start by asking. Let me start by asking Dr. Sarab, because I think he is a bit of he has a meeting. So the question is, can you shed light on the economic structural policy addressing the new role of the private sector or enhancing the role of the private sector?
I think we might have lost him already.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, I'm trying to stop sharing.
Yes, it's fine. I mean, there are many questions here. We have many questions. One of the questions is also for His Excellency Dr. Patrick. The question is, could you expand more on the yield curve control and what would happen if it was implemented? Dr. Patrick.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a good question. I'm afraid a difficult one. I think at this stage, there's an ongoing debate about yield curve control going on.
Dr. Patel, just 1 second, please. Dr. René, could you stop the screen sharing? Because we have your slide. Can you stop the screen sharing?
Yes, it's on. Thank you very much.
Dr. Patrick, Excellency Patrick, yes.
Yeah, I was saying I think the yield curve control is a very young debate. It's just starting to be debated among central bankers. I think we're quite far from a stage where it will be actually implemented. I think the idea is to traditionally central banks set the very short-term interest rate with a tool. So they, they can intervene in the interbank market. They can intervene in the overnight market. They can set the rate of reserve. So I think the central bank has the ability to have a great influence on short-term rates. But traditionally, we think that long-term rates are determined by the market, right? So the idea of yield curve control is that the central bank would adopt a target for long-term interest rate. For instance, they would say, we will intervene in the market so that the 10-year government bond yield will not exceed, a given number, 1%, 2%, and we will do whatever it takes to intervene in the market to reach that. So that's the idea. It's not been put in place so far. I think when central bank enter into a new area, when they adopt a new tool, their credibility is in question. So as a central banker, you want to do things only if you are sure that it's going to work. If you make a commitment to achieve a target and you are unable to do so, your credibility is affected. And I think central banks are always worried about that. So I don't think they will move in that territory until they know for sure that that's doable.
Okay. The other questions I have on the macro-prudential tools and what are the limits of macro-prudential tools and what are its side effects?
Okay, so I think the central banks have expanded their toolkits, with many macroprudential tools. I think the obvious one is capital buffers, and several of the panelists tonight have spoken about that. And there are different ways, different types of capital buffers. Some of them are for banks that are considered as systemic meaning that they are too big to fail. So they're so big that they present a risk for the system if they fail. So for those very large banks, the regulators ask that they provide more capital. Another type of capital buffer is called a counter-cyclical buffer. So the idea is to ask the banks to bring more capital when they are concerned that the credit cycle is becoming excessive, that they have too much credit. So the idea is, when the credit cycle becomes overheated, the banks will be asked to provide more capital in order to slow down their credit expansion. And that can be used when the credit cycle is too weak. So as currently, and it was the same during the global financial crisis in 2008. Credit tend to be pro-cyclical. So during a recession, there's not enough credit. During a boom, there's too much credit. So the counter-cyclical buffer is intended to go against that. So these are the macroprudential tools that affect the bank. Then some central bank, not all of them, but some, and certainly not the Federal Reserve, they have also adopted tools to manage indebtedness in the household sector. So certainly, in the run-up to the 2008 crisis, there was an excessive take-up of mortgage debt, especially by the so-called subprime borrowers. So the idea is to set a limit to that, for instance, with ratio like debt-to-income ratio or loan-to-value ratio, but basically limit the amount of debt that a borrower can take from the bank, and that's especially in the housing market. So that has been done in many countries that I know. It's been done in Iceland, it's been in Ireland, there's that in France as well. I think it's a little bit controversial because basically you're telling people if you don't have, if your capacity to bring a down payment for your house, if you don't have the capacity to bring a down payment, we don't want you to buy a house. So that has been criticized as being a restraint, a hinder to access to home ownership of low-income people. So it's controversial, but it's been used in many countries. So I think these macroprudential tools are among the new tools central banks have introduced to basically exert a greater influence not only on the economy, but also on the financial system and on the credit cycle.
Okay, thanks a lot. There is one more general question for you, Dr. Patrick, and it's good to hear that the policy toolkit has expanded, the monetary policy toolkit has expanded since 2008, but has anything changed on the ground?
Oh, I would say definitely so. If on the ground mean have these policies been effective?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to compare the situation, pre 2008, especially the first country that was that had to adopt new tool, especially quantitative easing, was Japan. So when Japan was confronted to a burst of its asset price goal, and it was a big burst, and also where Japan was affected by deflationary pressures. Especially at the time when the Japanese currency, the Japanese yen, was appreciating a lot. So basically the Bank of Japan had to experiment new tools, and it was not done in a way that was extremely effective. Japan was on the brink of deflation. Some people talk about a lost decade in Japan. So I think after the 2008 crisis, expanding the toolkit and going aggressively into quantitative easing has avoided deflation. Maybe the central banks have not been able to reach exactly their target of 2%, but they certainly been able to keep inflation above zero. So you have to think of what would have happened without these tools, and I'm afraid that what would have happened is a long period of deflation and stagnation. Instead of that, certainly judging from the US, inflation has been brought back closer to 2%, and the unemployment rate, as you saw on my slide, decline back to 4%, which is was the objective of the Federal Reserve. And just before the coronavirus, the unemployment rate was 3.5. So they went back to full employment. So if you want to judge, the effectiveness of this policy, yes, inflation went back close to target, and yes, unemployment, went back to the target. So the Federal Reserve was able to achieve its dual mandate. I think it's been in Europe, it's more complicated because of the Eurozone crisis, the situation in Greece. So we had a double dip situation. So it's more complicated, but I think the jury at this stage is that this new policy toolkit can be effective when it's used well.
Okay, thanks a lot. I have a question for Dr. Stephen. So it says here, will increasing tax in the Gulf Cooperation responsible economies stabilize your economy, and if so, what? I think this is back to the multiplier, Keynesian multiplier effect. And the second question is what is the most efficient way to do so or to approach that?
Okay, great. Yeah, those are very big questions. I mean, in the short run, taxes will be contractionary. There's no doubt about that. There's going to be short to medium term pain, no matter whether you tax income or whether you tax corporate profits or whether you tax value added at the consumer end. It does have to happen to provide a long-term non-oil revenue basis, but we also have to be aware that this long-term revenue basis also has to be based on genuine private sector activity, because right now a lot of the activity that you would be taxing is actually indirectly generated through state spending. So introducing the taxes is only one part of the equation. You also have to diversify the economy and generate private sources of household income that at some point are larger than the government provided source of household income, so that there's a genuine private economic cycle of demand generation. Otherwise, you have the government giving money with one hand and then taking it back with the other hand, which on a net basis might not make a very big difference, although it would slightly stabilize the revenue situation. In terms of which taxes to impose, I think VAT has been technically relatively attractive because it is relatively easy to impose and relatively hard to evade. It does, of course, have distributional implications. So if you want to introduce a VAT in a way that doesn't hit lower income households disproportionately, as is happening right now, because lower income households have a higher propensity to consume their income, so they're bearing proportionally more of that, then you need some compensation mechanism. And it could be exemptions for particular goods that are particularly important for lower income households, but generating exemptions is complicated, and the actual targeting you get there is not particularly efficient. So probably the better thing to do is to create compensation mechanisms where lower income households are directly compensated through cash grants, for example. And that's what Saudi Arabia has been trying with its citizens account program. There have been some administrative hiccups with it, but I think in terms of the general mechanics, this would be the way to go. You can tax consumption, which is relatively easy technically, but then you have to deal with the distributional consequences so that the poor households aren't hit disproportionately by redistributing some of it potentially. In the long run, there probably has to be income taxation. I don't think under the current circumstances where economies are flagging and everyone's talking about the need for stimulus, you want to pile income taxes on top of the consumption taxes. Probably the first step should be to gradually increase the consumption taxes. In the long run, they have to be very likely income taxes.
So that's our last question. I think the organizers are sending me some note that we have to go to the closing remarks and this beautiful and highly informative and highly intellectual debate addressing the economic stimulus program, the requirements and the challenges, and of course, I'm sure we have learned a lot here. There are what are the challenges and what are the requirement, what are new measures that we can think of, and what are the shortfall of each measures, and that would add to the debate. And the other interesting point that we are speaking at addressing these issues in a time that there could be going back and forth, or what you call activation and tampering of stimulus package. So whatever you have provided right now could serve as a base for further reaching the debate and translating it into a various policy recommendation tool and policy insight. I would like to thank you all. I would like to start thanking my Dr. Patrick. I'd like to thank Dr. Stephen Hertog, and of course, Dr. Surab from the World Bank, and Dr. Renee from the American University of the Emirate, and former advisor on the Inter-American Development Bank, and also our colleague, Mr. Mohammed Hamdawi, for his insightful and all of your insightful ideas and insight. Thanks a lot.